Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. A few days back I was watching a debate between Fight the Flat Earth versus Flatzoid on Modern Day Debate, and the topic of surveying came up.
Planar surveying uses horizontals. Why is that? All horizontals are always parallel to one another to make their measurements.
Now, I've previously done a video on the topic of surveying about 18 months ago. I'd had some surveyors that had been in touch with me already, confirming the Earth is a globe, saying they actually wish it was flat because it would make their jobs much easier. And then one surveyor reached out to me with some excerpts from this book called Surveying for Engineers about how surveyors correct for Earth curvature. And so the video I did was basically relaying those points and addressing why would surveyors be correcting for curvature if it didn't exist. Well, a few weeks after I'd published that video, there was a professor, James Fetzer, who went on and debated Austin Whitsitt, and he used that video of mine for his argument of the Earth being a globe, and Austin attempted to rebut it.
Let's cover some of the basics here. So when we do engineering, we actually use plane survey. We never use geodetic surveying ever. In fact, we can't build bridges, railways, runways, buildings, or anything without assuming the Earth is flat. Now, all survey manuals will tell you that, up to 100 square miles, 100 square miles, not 120 meters, 100 square miles, you have to assume that the Earth is flat, completely neglect any notion of curvature.
Now, the video that I did, I didn't specifically address plane surveying versus geodetic surveying. I just highlighted that the book had mentioned that at shorter distances, correction amounts are negligible and so can be ignored, but then that means that at longer distances, they can't. And both Austin and Flatzoid acknowledge there is a difference between plane and geodetic surveying.
So what they do with geodetic surveying is they assume the Earth's a sphere, they take the plane survey data, they stitch it together over long distances, and then they apply an R value, okay, that they assume.
Because I'm going on what we can observe. You don't observe geodetic surveying. They use planar surveying measurements and then calculate their ellipsoidal model into it to get their desired result.
Although it seems to me like they're trying to make it sound like plane surveyors are always the technique used up to 100 square miles, and then beyond that is when you then switch to geodetic, and that geodetic surveys are just plane surveys stuck together and then curve added based on the presumption the Earth is a globe. Although, at least they acknowledge that geodetic surveys have curvature corrections applied to them.
They stitch it together over long distances, and then they apply an R value.
When you take geodetic surveying, they assume an ellipsoidal model, the Clarke model, which is based on ellipsoid, so spherical. So they take spherical corrections, hence spherical axis, which doesn't exist.
Now, that acceptance alone causes a big problem for the idea of the Earth being flat, which I'll cover in this video. But when you look into the topics further, you'll find there's actually more differences between plane and geodetic than just have we reached 100 square miles yet. This is one of the reasons why I love making these videos. People often ask me, why do I waste my time on this? And the reality is, I'm not. 18 months ago, I knew very little about surveying techniques, but doing this pushes me to research them and expand my knowledge. It's why I've been using Brilliant.org now for more than 600 consecutive days. Each day I'll jump on for 10 or 15 minutes when I need to pass some time, and I'll hop into one of their classes. They have hundreds of maths, science, and computer topics to choose from, and it's a very effective way to expand your knowledge. I've recently been doing some of their classes on how to program with Python. And all the courses begin with the basics and build up gradually. And you can jump ahead to any point you feel like. So it doesn't matter what your current level is, there is something for everyone. Try it for yourself with a 30-day free trial using my link brilliant.org/Dave McKeegan, and doing so will entitle you to 20% off an annual subscription. So, plane and geodetic are both types of surveying. Surveying itself is described as the science of measuring and positioning points on land, sea, and air to create maps, land records, plan for construction, etc. For example, a surveyor could decide they're going to survey a plot of land to determine its size to put on a map. Well, you could run a tape measure around the edge of it, but maps are typically aerial views, and if the plot of land is situated on the side of a hill, then from an aerial view it would actually appear smaller and take up less space on the map. So surveyors can take readings from multiple points and the exact angles and distances between those points mapped out accurately to show any undulation in the land. So they'd set up a tool called a theodolite, which can very accurately measure angles both side to side and vertically. If they were to set the scope up exactly 5 feet above the ground and level it, and then place a reference marker a distance away from the theodolite that is also exactly 5 feet above the ground, and they point the theodolite scope at it, if the reference marker appears above the scope center line, then you know the land at the marker point is higher in elevation than the land at the theodolite. And surveyors can then very accurately measure the angle above level that the marker is to determine how much higher the elevation is, because they then know the distance away that the marker is from the theodolite. Plane versus geodetic simply describes how the surveyor is treating the Earth between their measurement points. Plane surveying presumes that the Earth between the points is a flat plane, whilst geodetic surveying presumes that the Earth is curving, and so they add corrections in to account for that curvature. Now, as we've already seen, both Austin and Flatzoid acknowledge that over long distances, geodetic is used and that curvature corrections are included. Their figures do differ slightly from each other. Austin says 100 square miles is the limit. Flatzoid says 150 square miles.
All survey manuals will tell you that, up to 100 square miles.
To get their desired result, and it's over 150 square miles. So
from what I've seen, the figures seem to suggest 100 square miles or 260 square kilometers is the limit for plane surveying. Now, it's worth clarifying here, just to be clear, 100 square miles is not a square 100 miles long by 100 miles wide. Square miles is a unit of area, so it's an area of 100 square miles, which would be a square 10 miles by 10 miles. Any surveys larger than that will be geodetic, which means they then have curvature corrections applied to them, that both Austin and Flatzoid have acknowledged. And this is where the problem arises for Flat Earth. Austin claimed all they do for geodetic surveys is take a series of plane surveys, stitch them together, and then apply a presumed curvature value based on a globe.
They take the plane survey data, they stitch it together over long distances, and then they apply an R value, okay, that they assume.
And Flatzoid seems to basically argue the same point, that surveys are done plane and that geodetics are then just formed by them wrapping them onto a globe model.
They use planar surveying measurements and then calculate their ellipsoidal model into it to get their desired result, and it's over 150 square miles. So
now that idea would work fine for a series of plane surveys in one dimension. If we were to say this little piece of paper is an individual plane survey, we could stick a series of these together in a long line and easily wrap it around the surface of a sphere. However, if we were to take plane surveys stuck together along two axes, so we create a large square survey, when we try and wrap that around the sphere, it creates distortions. So the distances between various points on the survey would then change. It's why there are so many different map projections, because you can't change the shape of something without distorting distances across at least parts of its surface. Over short distances, the errors are very small. Over longer distances, the errors get bigger and bigger. So you can get away with treating the Earth as a different shape over a short distance, but not over larger areas. So if the Earth is a globe, Obviously, treating it as a globe from the outset is the most accurate way of doing things, but treating it as a flat plane works over short distances and saves time by not requiring corrections to be applied, but then it becomes more and more inaccurate. Whereas if the Earth is flat, treating it as a flat plane is the most accurate way of surveying it, but treating it then as a globe would become more and more inaccurate over distance. So that means, given that they both acknowledge that geodetic surveys have curvature corrections applied to them, then if the Earth is flat, they must also then think every geodetic survey is wrong, and that they become more and more inaccurate the larger the survey is. Now, I'd also like to bring up another point that Flatsoid tried to argue.
It takes the curvature of the Earth into account, but plane surveying doesn't, because it doesn't need to for that small distance for the accuracy.
Great. So this brings me back to the triangulation. I'm glad you brought in arc with a continental triangulation. And do you know planar surveying works up to 150 square miles? How much curve would you expect in 150 square miles?
I don't know the exact figure, but it's small enough that they can ignore it.
Okay, so if we say for instance, observation
accuracy of it that much.
Telescope. Okay, let's say, for instance, we use a telescope looking out at the ocean. Should we then say we shouldn't see curve, boats going over the curve then?
So it seems he's trying to argue along the lines of plane surveying inaccuracies being linked to curvature drop, i.e., the limit for plane surveying is 100 square miles, so 10 miles in a straight line, and curvature drop at 10 miles is about 67 feet. So he thinks plane surveying can then be deemed as accurate with almost 70 feet of objects cut away, which is not the case. Now, if we go back to my example at the start about surveying a plot of land, and we say that the land is exactly 10 miles from end to end, the differences between a plane survey versus a geodetic survey isn't the distance between those 2 points across the surface of the land, because they would measure the same, but rather the difference in the shortest distance between them. On a circle, this is called the chord length versus going over the surface, which is the arc length. Based on a globe with a radius of 3,959 miles, the difference between the arc length and the chord length across 10 miles is less than 4 millimeters. Yet at 20 miles, the difference is about 4 centimeters. Hence, the inaccuracy up to 100 square miles is pretty negligible, but beyond that, it starts becoming more and more significant. Hence, the need to then begin accounting for curvature. But depending on what is being surveyed and why, the inaccuracy of plane surveying can be too great even at much shorter distances. As I alluded to earlier, surveying can be used for multiple different types of measurements, given that theodolites can measure angles both horizontally and vertically. And often, surveying is used to plot out the changing elevations of land, such as hills, with a method called trigonometric heighting, which is pretty basic trigonometry that I've actually demonstrated before in another video, simply with a ruler and a protractor to calculate the height of a plastic bottle. You measure your ground distance from an object and then measure its elevation angle. This essentially gives you two components of a triangle, which is all you need to solve the rest of the triangle, including the height of the object's side. Engineering surveyors can use this, for example, to work out the heights of buildings. Now, the Surveying for Engineers book that I have actually talks about trigonometric heighting, stating, quote, "Because the slope length of the line of sight between 2 points may be in the order of kilometers, it is necessary to take into consideration the effects of curvature of Earth and the refraction of light by the atmosphere. In single-ended trigonometrical heighting, the observations are taken from one end of the line only, and curvature and refraction must be allowed for in the calculations. In reciprocal trigonometric heighting, observations are taken from each end of the line of sight, but not at the same time. Curvature and refraction must again be taken into account. In simultaneous reciprocal trigonometrical heighting, the observations are taken from each end of the line at exactly the same time in order that curvature and refraction effects will cancel each other out in the calculations." Essentially what this means is, if you are measuring the elevation angle of a hill to work out its height, you're going to have to go some distance back from the hill in order to get a clear view at the top of it. But if you're on a globe, then the bottom part of the hill will have begun to drop below your local horizontal, so the hill would then measure lower than it really is. Hence, you then have to take the curvature into account with your calculations. It's the same basic problem as when flat earthers are asked how high is the sun or the moon based on their elevation angles. It should be very easy to work out with basic trig, but it doesn't work unless you include corrections for Earth curvature into the calculations, which obviously flat earthers don't want to do. But the point is that when they are surveying elevations, Earth curvature corrections have to be applied at much shorter distances, even though they are well within 100 square miles. Because over 10 miles, the difference in chord length versus arc length is a matter of millimeters, yet the curvature drop from the theodolite level at that distance is 20 meters or 67 feet. So plane surveying can work at those distances for surface measurements, but elevation measurements become incredibly inaccurate. For example, Flatzoid in his debate brings up a diagram from a surveying website and argues that all surface measurements are done over a horizontal plane. Now, this specific diagram that he is showing is a technique in surveying called differential leveling, which is a technique used to work out elevations across various parts of land. However, when you read up on differential leveling, it does say not to have your sighting positions more than 230 feet apart, which is only 70 meters. There's a website called Learn CST, which basically teaches people how to become surveyors. They've got modules on everything. They do have a section on how to do differential leveling, but they also have a topic on how to do trigonometric leveling. And trigonometric leveling can be done over much larger distances than the 70-meter limit of differential leveling. However, in order to do trigonometric leveling, you have to include Earth curvature corrections. Although before I move on, I would like to bring up an interesting little anecdote I stumbled upon in my research. That excerpt from the surveying book mentioned reciprocal trigonometrical heighting, which is where the surveyor takes a measurement from point A to point B, and will then go to point B and take a second reading back to point A. They do a similar thing with reciprocal leveling as well. But back in the 1730s, there were disagreements in the US about the ownership of land between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Eventually, an agreement was reached with a new borderline proposed. This led to British surveyor Jeremiah Dixon and astronomer Charles Mason of the Royal Society being commissioned to go and survey this newly agreed 233-mile-long borderline, which they did between 1763 and 1767. It became known as the Mason-Dixon line, which separates Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, and Delaware. And part of the method of the surveying that they did, at least at that time, was that after moving forward a few measurement points, they would turn about and take a single measurement back several points to ensure that the measurements conformed with what they were expecting from the combination of the previous few measurements. Essentially like a form of quality control check. Now, some degree of variation is always expected, that's why you have margins of error. But typically such errors will be random. However, what Mason and Dixon were finding was that they were getting consistent errors, i.e., the errors were consistently wrong in the same direction. And this was back when leveling the theodolites was done with a plumb bob. Now, Mason and Dixon were sent to do this survey by the Royal Society, and they were relaying this information of consistent errors back to them. And another notable member of the Royal Society at that time was Henry Cavendish. And Cavendish proposed that this error was actually being caused by the Allegheny Mountains, which are located at the western end of the Mason-Dixon line. Cavendish proposed that the large mass of the mountain range was creating a gravitational pull on the plumb bob, which was causing a slight deflection towards the west. This even led to the Schehallien experiment being conducted in 1774, using the gravitational deflection of a plumb bob to calculate the density of the Schiehallion Mountain in Scotland. I just thought that was amusing reading as another factor against flat Earth. Anyway, back to where we were. Austin, within his long response, claimed that all construction projects like bridges and runways all use plane surveying.
Again, in reality, the way we build runways, railways, bridges, everything, we have to make flat Earth measurements completely neglect the notion of a curvature. It's not accounted for anywhere, or we couldn't build buildings.
And a little bit of digging shows that the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, that regulates all civil aviation in the US, has the National Geodetic Survey Department do the surveys for all their airports. And I also found this document from the Civil Aviation Authority entitled Aerodrome Survey Information, which mentions that the most stringent survey accuracy is required and that the survey requirements are outlined by the WGS 84 manual. WGS is the world's geodetic system. And under the section for the survey procedures, vertical controls state that ellipsoid elevations are required. So it seems Earth curvature is actually applied to the surveys of airports. And the thing is, with modern surveying equipment now, a lot of the time, these corrections are actually automatically applied when they're taking the measurements. Typically, in the old days, or with lower budget projects these days, you'd use a theodolite for measuring the angle, but you'd then need a separate way of measuring the distance between the points that you're measuring. So you then have to manually correct for the curvature based on how far away you'd measured the points to be. But nowadays, you can buy tools called total stations, which are kind of like theodolites, but they have a built-in laser measurer. So the unit can not only work out the angle from level that the marker is, but the laser allows it to calculate the distance away as well. And if you look into the documentation of some of these total stations, they automatically apply the corrections for Earth curvature and standard refraction based on how far away the marker is from the station. Which then kind of presents a problem for all of the people who repeatedly claim that the Earth is measured flat. And just in case any flat earthers might then be thinking that the documentation is a lie, that it just says it's automatically applying curvature corrections, but it's really not, there should be a pretty easy way to check. Get hold of a total station that says it automatically corrects for curvature, and then get a measurement tool that doesn't, and take some long distance readings with them side by side. If they produce consistently different results, then the corrections are being automatically applied. And if curvature corrections are being automatically applied at all distances with a total station, then that either means the Earth is flat and every survey that's being done with those tools is wrong, or the surveys are correct and the Earth is a globe. And given that I also found this document from 1963 by the US Army Corps of Engineers, where they were testing and evaluating Earth curvature correction devices for their military mapping stereo plotter, I know which answer my money's on. I was actually intending on diving a bit more into the details of this document. However, I think this video's gone on long enough, and as subscribers of this channel probably already know, I'm kind of somewhat against the clock to get this video done because I'm heading off to Antarctica very soon. So I will try and cover that document in a future video next year. For now, I will say that's it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts and comments down below. If you've enjoyed this and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.